Hello and welcome to the Book House. My name is Anik G. Malchian and I'll be reading your bedtime story tonight. This week's reading is for Bus Stop on a Strange Loop by Shaune Lafferty Webb. Webb is a speculative fiction writer and one of the hardest working small press authors out there. Bus Stop on a Strange Loop is her first published work and it's one of my favourite stories of all time. Bus Stop began sometime in the not too distant future, where repeated collapses of the government have led to total civic disarray. Forced labour camps and what's termed eliminations have become the norm. Our protagonist, Nicky, is holed up in a city apartment block, leading a hand-to-mouth existence and neither knowing nor planning for what the future may hold. We join Nicky after a visit from a mysterious woman. The woman urges Nicky to search for his lost brother Ethan, even tells Nicky where to find him. At Rail's End, far west of the city, the woman leaves without introducing herself, and Nicky, who suspects another government raid is due, is left considering what few options he has left. We'll kick off from there. He drifted off to sleep in the remaining chair and only realised it when a sudden noise woke him. His eyes flicked towards the front door only to find the companion chair still in place. The sound must have come from somewhere else. He rose, discovering the muscles in his back and neck had stiffened up. The sound was louder now, and, fully awake, he recognised it as the bass rumbling of trucks in the street, 14 floors below. Careful to keep out of the direct line of sight, he crossed the floor quietly and wedged himself against one edge of the window. An oblique glance into the street confirmed his worst fears. The transports were back. Under the command of a different cohort, certainly, with a different agenda and a different set of tenants, probably, but the tactics would undoubtedly be the same. 2 years ago, he'd had a naive hope that he'd never see another of these actions. He'd weathered that coup purely as a consequence of his brother's position and value. Ethan had no position now, and it was doubtful anyone aware of his worth had made it into the new regime. He backed away from the window into shadow, heart racing. It was impossible to judge how thorough this cult was going to be, but he'd counted enough transports in the street to give him cause for concern. There was no particular incident he knew of that might have sparked this latest action. He wasn't in the loop, but there were a number of possible objectives. Interrogation, relocation, elimination. He'd already experienced relocation and interrogation, neither of which he had the stomach to repeat, and the last simply wasn't an option. Clearly, his brief reprieve was over. Below, the streets were already beginning to fill with his neighbours, and had apparently been spilling out of their doorways for some time. Perhaps they were prepared to pin their hopes on the chance that obedience might elicit compassion. But Nicky wasn't. As noiselessly as he could, he eased a chair away from his door. Soon they'd began combing the buildings, floor by floor, to look for lingerers and anyone who'd attempted to hide. There was no way he could get out of the building and escape detection. He had to find somewhere inside, somewhere they wouldn't go. He ran into the corridor and straight for the bank of elevators. The panels above each elevator were still flashing, 2 indicating floors below him, and the third claiming the 16th floor. Below was no good. They could have entered the building by now, and he might run into them as they ascended the stairwell. It had to be up. With the flat of his hand, he shoved the button to call the elevator, hoping desperately it wouldn't work, and shot off towards the stairwell. Seconds were precious, and he couldn't afford to waste any of them waiting to see if the elevators had suddenly sprung to life. He'd find out soon enough on the 16th floor, and if they had, he'd have to come up with another plan. Fast. He flew up the stairs in darkness. Never having cause to memorize any of the floors above 14, he just had to hope that all the treads were intact, that he could make it there in time, that the elevator had refused to budge and wasn't stuck somewhere between floors, that he could force the doors open and closed again, and, if all that panned out, that finding the elevators inoperative, no one would bother to look there. It was a lot to hope for. There was no one on the 16th floor when he burst through the fire doors. He'd come across no one on the stairs either. So either everyone on the upper floors had already filed into the streets, or they were holding out behind locked doors. Nicky skidded around the corner, making for the elevators. A head-first collision into the chest of a giant almost brought him to his knees. He yelled at the man to move as he grabbed hold of the giant's wrist to pivot himself free. His weight was against the elevator doors long before he thought to glance at the overhead panel. It still indicated 16. That link in his chain was still holding.
But it seemed that the most crucial was about to fail. The doors wouldn't budge and his feet kept slipping on the cracked tiled floor. Even when he saw the giant reappear around the corner and start rushing towards him, he didn't let up. This time, he wasn't going down without a fight. As the giant gained ground, Nicky finally recognized him. His name was Carl, or something like that, another tenant in the building anyway. But if Carl intended to betray him, he'd have to drag him down the stairs and into the street to do it. When Carl leaned a massive shoulder into the door beside him, Nicky spared time for a welcome breath and another glance at the man. The giant just smiled and kept on pushing. Fractionally at first, the doors began to give, gliding easily at the last to throw them both off balance for a moment. The bottom of the cab wasn't perfectly aligned with the floor, but it was only an easy half-metre off. First Nicky, then Carl, jumped inside and once again took up the struggle with the doors, straining to close them. They couldn't manage to bring the doors completely together. A sliver of space still remained, and they were running out of time. Sounds were beginning to reach them from the lower floors, voices and footsteps. It would have to do. If they kept to the corners of the cab, in the shadow, they might be all right. Nicky backed away toward the rear of the cab. Carl followed suit, making for the opposite corner. It was a relief to see that even he disappeared completely into the shadows. They both stayed crouched and silent in their respective corners for what seemed like a very long time. His gamble had apparently paid off. Once the elevators had been found inoperable, they'd been eliminated from the search. It was difficult to see much through the sliver between the elevator doors, just an occasional blur of movement, but they could hear men barking orders, footsteps nearby in the corridor, and once the unmistakable sounds of a scuffle, terminated by a loud crack and a small vibration in the wall outside the cab. The noise brought a sickening image to Nicky's mind. Someone's skull had been slammed into the concrete. All Nicky could do was ignore it and cower in his corner, desperately hoping against his own detection. The impotence disgusted him. It had to have been hours since there'd been any sound inside the building or from outside on the street. Huddled there in the darkness, it was hard for Nicky to know which was worse, hearing his neighbours go to an uncertain fate, or listening to his own uncontrollable thoughts. Trying to combat those thoughts was like trying to hold back an avalanche with the palm of one hand. Where had his neighbours been taken, and why? How long could he and Carl hold out? What would happen to them if they were discovered? What would happen to them if they weren't? Where was safe? Where wasn't? And, inexplicably, over and over again, he found his thoughts turning to the fate of the woman who'd visited him last night. Her years wouldn't play in her favour. Why did he bother to think of her, worry about her? She'd blown in and out of his door like a soft whisper, urging him in a direction he had no inclination to go. She wasn't his responsibility or his concern, and yet he couldn't push her away. He was almost grieving for her. For the 100th time, Nicky struggled to concentrate on his own predicament. It had to have been hours. His body was rigid as steel, gone far beyond discomfort, and his bad leg had begun to ache from the lengthy crouch on the floor. He risked trying to stretch it out. "Carl," he whispered, and grimaced as the circulation returned towards his toes. A voice answered from the opposite corner of the cab. "Is it time?" Nicky struggled to his feet, asking himself the same question. Was it time? Beside him, the giant was moving, blocking out the shaft of light from the corridor. "Can you help me with the doors?" Nicky pushed away from the wall and joined Carl at the front of the cab. On the third attempt, the doors gave, opening the way to the abandoned corridor. He hesitated, grateful for the moment it took to adjust to the light. It gave him time to delay the panic, time to find the courage he needed to shove the terror of what lay outside back into that dark corner of the elevator. The half-metre step wasn't as simple as it should have been. Carl fared better, taking the step easily. Nicky had escaped the tomb-like atmosphere of the elevator, only to find himself confronted by spectres in the abandoned corridor. All around him he could sense his absent neighbours. It was guilt, he knew, and tried to shake off the pointless emotion. Guilt wasn't going to do them any good. His giant companion seemed to have a goal in mind, and had taken off down the empty corridor. Any course of action was better than none at all, so Nicky struck off after him. The lights were flickering now, but it was still enough to see by. Another stroke of fortune. Daylight never reached the interior of the building, and Nicky was relieved not to be stumbling around in the dark, uncertain of what, or who, lay in front of him. Up ahead, Carl nudged an apartment door fully open and was slipping inside. As he trailed the giant inside, Nicky took in the new generation of scuff marks on the dingy paint of the door. They weren't the only evidence of the recent invasion. Debris was scattered everywhere. Likely his own apartment now mirrored this one, which he supposed was Carl's. His host glanced at him over his shoulder. "We can't stay here any longer. Do you have somewhere to go?" Nicky answered with a shake of his head. "Then you'd better come with me," Carl said after a brief hesitation. Stepping around the broken and scattered glass littering the floor, he made for a small hall that shot off at right angles to the main room. If this apartment mirrored his in plan as well as chaos, then the hall led to the single bedroom. Nicky waited in the centre of the main room, resisting the ridiculous impulse to right the chairs and gather the shards of glass. Moments later, Carl emerged, carrying 2 backpacks. "It's unlikely the transports will come back here again," he said, "but they'll cut the power and the water for certain, and with everyone gone—" His companion didn't bother to elaborate, just shrugged and headed for the kitchen, tossing the packs to Nicky as he passed. "We'll need food." By the time Nicky joined him in the kitchen, the giant's big hands were already scavenging amongst the shelves of an open cabinet. Bringing the packs over, he began to stow the items that Carl was setting aside, the remnants of what once must have been quite a stockpile. His neighbour was evidently a resourceful character, a trait that wouldn't go astray in their present situation. The cupboard emptied of everything useful into their packs, Nicky began adding the bottles of greyish water the big man was filling from the tap. "If we're careful, we should be all right," Carl said. "They were obviously in a hurry." It struck Nicky as something of a pathetic gesture when, presumably through habit, Carl went back and closed the cupboard doors. He dropped the 2 overstuffed packs to the floor, about to ask Carl what he had in mind, when the big man spoke again. "I come from a village just west of here." He skirted around Nicky, stepped effortlessly over the packs, and headed towards the front of the apartment. "We'll be safe there." Nicky was on the big man's heels, following him into the front room. Something wasn't right. No one did something for nothing. "All right," he said. "What's in this for you?" With one hand to the arm of the sofa, Carl flipped it upright, then looked over at Nicky. "Nothing," he said, and bent to wrench the cushion away from the seat. "It was the elevator. I'd never have thought of it." Carl rummaged around at the back of the sofa, startling Nicky when his big hand reappeared with a rare prize nestled in its palm. 4 pristine red apples, as perfect as the day they'd been plucked from the tree. A resourceful man indeed. Nicky went back into the kitchen to retrieve the packs.
And that was my reading for Shaune Lafferty Webb's Bus Stop on a Strange Loop. How'd you like it? It's one of my favourite books and I'm so glad I got to share it with you. You can find the whole thing linked in the description below, and if you do buy it, you'll be supporting one of the hardest working small press authors out there. If you have a suggestion for something you'd like read or reviewed, you can comment below or contact me via email or on my blog. I'll be back on Friday with a video review for Bus Stop on a Strange Loop. It's a long title. I don't know who gives these long titles to things. Until then, read well.
Te vienen buscando, te vienen buscando.